Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along for a final session of the conference. We must bid these fine surroundings farewell, which is a shame. It'd be nice to come to a place where I usually come for weddings only, for something other than weddings. So it's been interesting. I'm particularly pleased to welcome our guests from Huddersfield Grammar and the young people that have come on to the session today. It's really appreciated. And quite novel to have an event about young people in politics that actually has some young people involved. So we hope that during the next hour and a half we might incite you to contribute to the debate and to give us some feedback on some of the proposals that we're pitching regarding the project we're talking about this afternoon, beyond the Youth Citizenship Commission, Young People in Politics project, which we're publishing today. Which is going to be aimed at politicians, policymakers, people working in youth organisations, teachers, and young people themselves, trying to develop new policy agendas as we go forward to the 2015 general election. We want the general election in 2015 to be about young people as well as the more traditional groups. And in a way, what we're publishing today is only the beginning of a conversation. It is simply a starting point that we want young people and other people to engage with and to develop new policy approaches. Beyond that, what we really want to achieve is a change in mindset, that young people are no longer invisible citizens that are typically overlooked by our political class. We want to see a step change in political culture so that young people are shaping their own lives, their own futures, and the politics that is supposedly serving them. And as part of that, we thought rather than simply having a framework where we read the wonderful words that we constructed back to you, you can all read the volume. There's copies of it on the chair. Please take them away. They are there for your reference. That we get a panel together of people with deep interest in youth citizenship. And so we've got 4 people together. Unfortunately, we've lost one of our members today, Beth Craig, Councillor, Manchester City Council. She's unfortunately detained at another panel today. But the 4 people who've got on the panel today have, in their own different ways, contributed enormously to the development of youth citizenship. To my immediate left is Professor John Tonge, Professor of Politics at the University of Liverpool. He was the chair of the Youth Citizenship Commission, which was set up by Gordon Brown and sat between 2008 and 2009, and has also then gone on to publish widely about issues like young people in politics. Next to him is Ian Wybron, who's representative of Demos, which is a leading think tank based in London, which has been extremely influential over the last decade or so in shaping public debate about various issues linked to citizenship and to young people in politics. And Ian is part of a project at the moment which is entitled Generation Citizen, which argues that there is something unique about this current generation of young people, and that citizenship itself is a way in which they can realise and face some of the challenges that they face at the moment. Next to Ian is Professor Gerry Stoker, who's the Professor of Governance and Politics at the University of Southampton. Gerry has been an influential and important figure in many areas of British politics over the last 30 years, and continues to find new ways in which we think about politics. And it's been an enormous pleasure to work with him on this project. Gerry's contributed in important ways in shaping what we've done with the Beyond the Youth Citizenship Commission project, and what we are going to continue to do with that project after today's launch. It's great to have a lot of time today. And last, and in many ways most importantly, is Sam Johnson, who's a representative of Manchester Youth Council. He's a student in the city himself, and is a real-life young person. So it's nice to have a real-life young person on.
He's getting older every night.
He is getting. We're all getting older at the moment, but some I've got a little bit more to look forward to in that stretch of life than others. I fear that I'm on the lesser of the two scales. And it's great to have something like that. Manchester City Council should be congratulated in a climate where local authorities are feeling the need to cut funding for youth representative initiatives. They actually went against the grain and set up a youth council in 2013, 2012, and they should be congratulated for it. Youth representation frameworks are vital, and for a city as important as my own city not to have a youth council was a real drawback, and I'm very pleased that Sam is giving us time today. What we're going to do with the session is we're going to start off with Professor Tonge. John's going to talk a little bit about the background of the Citizenship Commission and how we've come to the point of the new project which we're launching today. And then the rest of our panel are going to offer some thoughts on their view on young people politics. Beyond that, I'm then going to come out and in a kind of calamitous David Dimbleby sort of way, I'm going to try and provoke some debate about some of the issues that we're raising. So, to put it bluntly, we really wanted to hear your viewpoints, and particularly the young people. So, John, next.
Thank you very much, Andy. Okay, my role is very brief. I shan't unduly detain you because I want to hear our speakers. But I do want to say a few words of thanks at the start. I particularly want to thank the Political Studies Association for paying for this, putting up the tab for the Beyond the Youth Citizenship Commission Young People in Politics booklet. It's an important way of taking things forward. What are we taking things forward from? Well, we're taking things forward from two reports that were done by the Youth Citizenship Commission. These two reports, one, making the connection, building youth citizenship in the UK, and the other, old enough to make a mark, should the voting age be lowered to 16, which I'm hoping we'll have a robust debate about this afternoon. The Youth Citizenship Commission was introduced, I think, to the great credit of the previous government. The Labour government in 2008 saw that there was, to some extent, perhaps I don't like using the term crisis, but there was a problem of formal and to some extent informal political engagement amongst young people. That is not to demonise young people whatsoever, but very quickly the Youth Citizenship Commission concluded that young people were not apathetic about politics. They're more interested in politics than ever before. Have a look at the number of university applications to study politics. They're at an all-time high. There's plenty of interest amongst young people in politics. But what there was a disconnection. Firstly, in terms of how young people define citizenship, they didn't make the connection between good citizenship and, for example, voting. Good citizenship was seen as obedience to the law, compliance rather than active participation. Secondly, there was a lack of knowledge about formal political institutions, we found. Young people in particular didn't know a great deal about local councils and how they worked. And thirdly, there was to some extent a switch off in terms of young people's participation. We've seen that in terms of declining election turnouts amongst young people. A final thing the Commission really did stress was we need greater political literacy in Britain. You wouldn't expect people to go out and drive a car without giving them any training or giving them some knowledge about how to drive a car, and yet we expect young people who become adults to go out and vote and participate in the political system without helping them. There isn't the politics GCSE. Citizenship classes very patchy in terms of the quality and quantity of citizenship education. So how do we expect young people to become politically literate? Those are some of the points that we made to the Brown government in our reports in June 2009. Obviously we've had a change of government since, but the issues of youth political participation have not gone away. If anything, they loom even larger overall polity, and there's the ongoing debate, for example, over whether the voting age should be lowered. So these issues are reflected, you'll see, if you turn to page 5, this is what I really want to be discussed this afternoon. These 10, hopefully clear proposals that come from this booklet Beyond the Youth Citizenship Commission. And you can boo, hiss, cheer these proposals. Let's have a strong debate around them. I want to thank, not just the Political Studies Association, I want to thank Andy MyCock, who's done the hard yards in terms of putting this booklet together. I want to thank Gerry Stoker, who has very generously funded meetings that have allowed this booklet to take shape. Same with James Sloan, who is somewhere in this room. But above all, I would like to thank the Political Studies Association for taking this agenda forward. It's vital that we debate the best ways in which young people can participate. And you'll see, some of these proposals I think are clear. compulsory electoral registration in schools and colleges across the UK. Let's have a referendum on voting age, etc., etc. So I'm hoping for a good, robust debate. That really is my role as purely the facilitator today. I think, without further ado, we move to hear from Demos. There.
Okay, so my name is Ian. I work for Demos in their Citizenship and Political Participation programme. The report that was mentioned before, Introducing Generation Citizen, really tried to change the tide that we're seeing in the media, which is portraying young people as feckless, not interested in politics. What we found through a large-scale poll of young people, 1,000 young people, is that actually 4/5 of them think that they're more socially engaged than any previous generation. And not only that, this was backed up by the teachers we asked. 2/3 of teachers thought exactly the same. What's changed is that whilst people believe this generation of teenagers believe they're more socially engaged, they are less politically engaged. The political class for them is a distant thing that they just do not engage with. Not only this, they are engaged differently in social issues. They are digital natives, is the way we describe them in the report. They're surrounded by internet information constantly. It's coming at them very, very fast, which means, of course, they're going to engage differently with social issues. What I found with the Youth Citizenship Commission proposals is that what I liked about them is that it is important that we re-engage people with traditional politics. It isn't about just saying, actually, young people today are engaging in different ways, and that's fine. Whilst we do need to foster these new ways of engagement and use social action in communities, we do also need to make sure that traditional politics stays relevant to people. Voting is important, and we need young people to re-engage with the process. But there are two other points that I'd like to make very quickly. One is that it isn't just about giving young people the vote. It isn't just about lowering that age to 16. Young teenagers need to feel involved in all aspects of public life. Public services need to be built with young people in mind, involving young people in the decisions that are made. One of the things we're doing at Demos at the moment is piloting co-production in schools. And what that means is actually teachers, instead of telling children what to do all the time, are actually inviting them to say what they want to change about school, how they want things to be run. The idea being that actually if you can get that engagement, then you start seeing better results in school, better behaviour and that sort of thing. It's really about getting this buy-in. And the other thing, one of the proposals that interested me most is about teaching young people to engage critically with social media. As I said at the start, people are surrounded by new media, the internet. They have access to vast amounts of information that previous generations didn't have. And it's vitally important that actually people are taught to come to this information in a critical way so that they can read between the lines and make positive decisions and ultimately have a better political engagement. Thanks.
Gerry.
I thought we had some good things. Gerry, thanks.
I'm Sam Johnson from Manchester Youth Council. It's actually really weird because when this came up, the Youth Council had actually talked about these things before, and a lot of the things that are in this commission we had actually said ourselves in terms of we want the referendum for people to lower the voting age and the compulsory electoral registration. We really wanted that in schools, but really one of the things that we had talked about is making sure that young people were represented. It was our idea that we wanted young people voting and getting involved in politics and traditional politics, even though they're still engaged with groups, green groups, whatever kind of groups. We wanted them to actually be represented within Parliament. They needed to be represented in some kind of commission and actually talk to. One of the things about having MPs to actually go and talk to young people specifically was a great idea. Whether or not this needs to be furthered into something else, such as actually having young people represent themselves within their community somehow, or in terms of setting up, making sure that they have local school councillors within the schools and having that kind of voting experience already. If you start voting early and learning about politics early, then you'll get to learn it later on in life and you'll already be involved straight away. One of the things that happens quite a bit is some of my friends come forward and say that they don't have an interest in politics. But a great quote, and I think it's Plutarch that says it, and it says, you may not have an interest in politics, but politics has an interest in you. Thanks.
Okay, I'm Gerry Stoker. I'm one of the people who contributed to this report, and in some ways I feel a little bit of a fraud in that I've never actually investigated young people in politics as young people in politics, and that's because I spent much of my last 10 years not trying to ask why young people don't like politics, but asking why virtually no one likes politics. And I think that that's the important context to actually put our debate in. Sometimes it's kind of implied that somehow or other young people are odd because they're pissed off with politics. That's the new normal. In fact, in the survey work that we've done, the reason why I think I'm particularly interested in engaging young people is because they are the only potential source of optimism if we're actually going to renew our politics. Because if you look at the survey work and you ask a series of questions about what people think negatively about politics, there's some in my report, which is politics is too short-term and media-driven, too dominated by special interests, politics is a waste of time. There is indeed an age profile to the way in which you get responses to those questions. But the age profile is that the older you get, the more clearly annoyed you are with politics. And you get an even more negative reaction to politics amongst those people that have experienced it to a much greater degree. And actually there's a kind of wonderful optimism about young people, and that comes out in response to another question that we have regularly asked in surveys as well, which is, because whether you're going to get involved in politics really depends on just how bad politics is. So you can imagine a scenario that if it was really, really bad, then you'd all have to get involved. Or alternatively, if it was a lot more open and there was a lot more genuine attempt to listen to people's views and there wasn't so much spin and there was a genuine attempt to try and reflect people's interests and people's views, that might attract people to engage as well. So we've tested whether a negative or a positive trigger, the positive trigger being politics being more open, the negative trigger being it's got so bad you really do need to do something. And we actually tested to see whether that would shift people's levels of interest in politics. Now, in a way, it's nice when a piece of research really confirms your prejudices, but I'm of an age where I hardly ever shift my preferences or views at all, even in the light of quite strong evidence. And so it appears that it's very difficult to shift older generations in terms of their interest in politics. But it's much, much easier. Indeed, our survey findings suggest that at least 2/3 of the younger generation would be prepared to shift their level of interest in politics, some driven by the negative trigger, some are driven by the positive trigger. So the tone of the discussion for me is not, can we drag young people kicking and screaming into a goddamn awful politics, which seems to me a really stupid way of phrasing the question. The question should be, can we use the enthusiasm, the commitment, and the capacity for innovation which is in each new generation to actually transform a democratic politics which has become seriously distorted and seriously fails not just the young generation, but all generations within our democracies. And in that sense, I'm a strong supporter of all of the recommendations in the report, but particularly two. I would strongly support the idea of a referendum to introduce votes for people who are 16 and over, and in that referendum I would vote yes. And the reason why I vote yes is because it seems to me that we need to change the rules of the game of politics, and part of that change could be to encourage people to take much more seriously the interests and concerns of young people, and one of the ways in which you can do that is the vote. But let me say immediately, I don't think the vote is ever going to be enough. And it could well be, given what I've said to you before, that this could be a formula for disaster, which is I drag 16-year-olds into politics immediately, and after 2 years they realise how annoying it is, but by the time they get to 18, they've already resigned from their interest in politics. So I think that we need to then introduce other reforms, and one of the other reforms that I would strongly support, strangely because I actually proposed it myself, is that youth parliaments would actually have an opportunity each year to identify one topic that they wanted to put to a national referendum. In effect, it would be a popular initiative driven by the young generations of our society, and it would still be a democratic decision made by all citizens, but the crucial thing you need is not only the vote, but the capacity to set the agenda in politics. This is one measure that would trigger that. I'd be very happy to discuss other measures that could trigger that as well. But the main point of my contribution is to say, well, we should think about how we're framing this discussion. Too often when we talk about youth citizenship, we talk about it as if we've got a wonderful working democracy, and all we need to do is persuade young people to come and join this wonderful working democracy. Well, my starting point is that we haven't got a wonderful working democracy. What we need young people to do is come in and join it and make it a lot better than it currently is. Thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot to all our four speakers there. That's a really strong start. I suppose the first thing to do is just open up the floor to anyone that's got any points they'd like to make at this juncture about what our speakers have said. Does anyone want to respond to anything they've said? I don't think so. Oh yes, sorry.
Do you think in order to get youth interested in politics, you might need to commercialise politics? I mean, you said that youth are interested and that are apathetic, but the fact that we have things like media surrounding us all the time, we have the internet, so by commercialising politics and saying, hey, look at politics in this way, that young people will more actively participate within politics.
I think the only danger there would be, politics is supposed to be about your duties to other people, about how we want to live in a society together. I think if you commercialise it too much, then actually you lose part of, so there's something important there about what it's all about. In terms of having a new narrative that's far more positive and engaging for young people, that is broadcast more regularly, then I think that would be an important thing to do,
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends what you mean by the phrase commercialise, and I'm not entirely sure I understand what it means, but the positive of it for me would be if it's about thinking about how you can approach people in the same way as so many modern companies, organisations, or even cultural institutions now approach them in a way that actually makes sense and is immediately accessible, and it actually encourages interaction which is immediate and where you feel as if you're getting some kind of response. If that is partly what you're talking about, then yes, because I can think of nothing more to dampen people's enthusiasm for politics than to invite them into some of the tedious and spectacularly dull political meetings that I've been engaged in my life. And I'm only just talking about the conference here. I agree that some savviness in the way that you approach them, if that's what you mean, I think that would be good. On the other hand, in a lot of the other research work I've done, one of the points I make is actually one of the things which I think has blighted our politics is the overemphasis on political marketing and the way in which politicians emphasize so much now dominating the 24-hour news agenda, presenting little sound bites to people and creating little kind of what they call dog whistle issues that they can all follow. I actually think that that's been deeply problematic for politics. And there's a distinction in the way that people think, which I've been trying to use to get the message across, which is there's a classic distinction between fast and slow thinking. So fast thinking is when you're making a lot of quick decisions and you're just trying to react to events, and it's a great way of behaving because that's the way most people survive in a complex world. Slow thinking is when people reflect and maybe gather a bit more evidence and make a bit more of a careful decision one way or the other. The trouble with so much marketing is it actually encourages you just to do fast thinking all the time. And that means that people don't reflect on other people's interests, they don't reflect on different points of view, they don't actually engage in what is the important part of politics in the end, which is beginning to see the world through other people's eyes, beginning to see how issues could be confronted differently, and beginning to think about what is not only in your interest, but the interest of your fellow citizens as well. So, in that sense, if it became overly commercialised, I think I'd be worried, because I think it then becomes impossible to have that collective discussion. But if what you mean is politics just needs to be far more savvy about the way it has people and engages with people, 100% agree.
Good question.
Yeah, can I just respond briefly? It is a good question, it's a very interesting question. I mean, selling of politics, if that's what you mean, is interesting. It depends how you do it. The government provide examples of how not to do it. For example, the scheme to encourage young people to register to vote, rock and roll, rock and roll, get it? Is an example of crassness and an approach that shouldn't be used. But I think there is a need to sell politics to young people. I mean, notwithstanding Gerry's often legitimate criticisms of the politics that we're selling, but I think it is a nonsense that you can't study politics in schools until you're 17, until you're doing your A-levels. How are you supposed to learn about politics? Why not teach it earlier? And yeah, a lot of teachers are frightened of introducing it or using citizenship classes to teach politics. So how are you supposed to go and learn? Yes, of course you can be proactive and find out about politics yourself, but I think the fact that you actually are debarred from studying the subject until 17 is rising and needs changing.
Sam, how do you do? You're working with young people all the time, and I'm sure you get responses which are both positive and less positive, to understand. How do you make, the core of what you're saying is how do you make politics more attractive to young people? How do you make politics?
In terms of, like, for young people, is making things, politicians nowadays have a lot of this whole, they'll blabber on for ages and talk about absolutely nothing. You ask them a question, and they won't answer the question, they'll have just told you a bunch of gobbledygook. And basically, for younger people that we've spoken to, it's about making politics a lot more simpler and a lot more clearer towards them. And in terms of like use of social media, a lot of political parties nowadays are starting to use social media to talk to other people. But I don't think that I think that it's two different types of politics in terms of like, we're trying to get traditional politics back on the agenda, whereas young people nowadays are starting to engage more in the alternative ways in terms of groups and actually being active that way.
It's a good point, it's a very good point, yes, sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to relate to that, especially when I look at the recommendations, very interesting recommendations, but they do look for a large part as a form of accommodating youth into the game as it is, the kind of structures that are available, the kind of processes and institutions that young people may or may not want to buy into. And I don't see really any efforts there to relate to the forms of engagement with issues, for example, the kind of ideas about alternatives that are actually already there among youth, that young people are talking about, and even to learn to speak the language of young people. How do young people even conceive of issues and challenges in their lives and relate to that rather than, opening the door? Rather, politicians could also step out of that door and see what's going on there and try to make a relation with that respect.
It's a good point. I think we were aware of that, and our focus is on traditional forms of politics in a way because we are older, and I don't think possibly we have the right to dictate the terms of what young people want to reshape politics to be. This is a starting point of the conversation, and what the idea is to talk to our young people and say to them, right, you tell us where you want to go. I don't think it's for us to dictate those terms. And in a way, I think that's why we're so pleased to see so many young people today. Politicians talk to you in languages that you don't understand. How many people would agree with that, young people? Do you understand politicians? Anyone that struggles? Yeah.
So that's a case of understanding them, more a case of they don't particularly say. Politicians don't engage with issues that relate to young people,
Okay.
rather than it being sort of translated to how young people, interact. And also, the issue is as well is that when there's other avenues open, such as you've got the increase in e-democracy, lots of petition sites, etc. There's not really a need for young people at this point, increasingly, for them to engage with traditional politics when there are these other avenues open. So if you want people to engage with traditional politics, I think using those other avenues is the first step, and then from there, bring it in.
Good point. I saw a hand up behind as well. It went back down. Very wise. I'll come back and around you later on. One of the things